Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Anna Bigelow. I'm the director for the Center for South Asia here at Stanford, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. I'd also like to thank the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies at Stanford for their co-sponsorship of this event. We'll begin, of course, with our land acknowledgement that we recognize that Stanford is an occupier of the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We are grateful to be guests on this land and commit to solidarity with Indigenous rights. Over the last year, the Center for South Asia has hosted a series of events centering caste and minoritized communities in South Asia. So please check our events page to learn more, as we will be continuing this programming into next year. And we are really delighted to have this session today to continue that conversation. I will introduce our moderator, and then the moderator will introduce our speaker. Our moderator today is Ali Osman Qasmi. He's Associate Professor of History at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS in Pakistan. He's the author of Questioning the Authority of the Past, the Ahl al-Quran movements in the Punjab, and the Ahmadis and the Politics of Religious Exclusion in Pakistan. Qasmi is currently a visiting fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center, and we've been very lucky to have him with us this whole last year. So over to you, Ali.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this very generous introduction. And I'm so glad to be moderating this very important webinar with Professor Sanober Umar, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Politics at York University. Her current work explores the relationship and critical distinctions between caste and racial hierarchies, and how these entanglements along with gender and class dynamics inform the figure of the Muslim in Indian and global politics. For her upcoming project, Dr. Umar is investigating the transnational politics of racializing and gendering Islam as a religion in mainstream and academic discursive productions of a universalized and flexible Muslim world. She is also a principal investigator for a SSHRC IDG funded project that explores the histories, politics, and theories behind the idea of the diasporic exiled public intellectual, particularly in the age of rising social media disinformation, far-right global populism, and the changing political landscape of multicultural Canada. She's a PhD in history from Queen's University, an MSc in migration studies from University of Oxford, and an MA in international history and politics from Graduate Institute of International Studies and Development in Geneva. Her research interests broadly speak about race and racism, gender issues, Islam and Muslim societies, post-colonial theory, decolonial thought. And today she will be talking about caste politics, and it's part of our ongoing conversations about issues relating to caste, about Dalit politics in South Asia, and how it is, as part of a broader conversation that informs politics as part of academic activism, and how it relates to everyday life in South Asia, broadly speaking. And we are so very honored and glad that Professor Sanober Umar will be speaking about Pasmanda Muslim as a category, and how it relates to broader issues relating to caste politics in India. Over to you. And just to remind you, to tell our audience that Professor Umar will be presenting. She'll be reading her paper for about 30 minutes, and then as a follow-up, we'll have the chat box is open. You can post your questions. And then we'll be taking these questions and asking them to Professor Umar. Over to you.
Thank you, Ali, for that very generous introduction. I would also like to thank Stanford Center for South Asia for inviting me, specifically Lalita Duperon, Anna Bigelow, and Samrat Kaur for their assistance, and of course Ali Osman Qasmi for his valuable time today as a moderator for this talk entitled Castaway, Conversion and Recognition in Pasmanda Muslim Politics. Of course, at the onset, it only makes sense to define how caste has been understood broadly. Ambedkar saw it as a system of graded inequality. Louis Dumont famously characterized it as a spectrum of ritual purity and pollution. Others have noted that the word caste collapses within it two separate categories of varnas and jatis, that is divisions within the Hindu society and endogamous groups with particular occupations. And often folks assume caste to be like a hereditary class system. Others see it as equivalent to race hierarchies. However, transnational translations that seek to uncover the complexities of caste fail to grasp that caste is neither simply class nor is it race. And as many scholars have noted, including my dear friend Shaista Patel, it is not exclusive to Hinduism or India. It remains unclear in narratives among the white cross demography of Muslims in Uttar Pradesh what exactly gets understood or practiced as caste in the region. Some note that it often overlaps with questions of ethnicity and tribe or biradri. Still others contend it is occupational. Still more claim that it is a genealogical project of tracing one's ancestries, whereas others have argued that the term Ashraf itself is not imbued with some inherent generational qualities, but rather signifies an individual's attributes of virtuosity and high culture taste, which can be inculcated via education. Several scholars have also noted that subdivisions within caste, or for that matter, who lies at the top of this so-called pure Muslim lineage, is also debatable in certain circumstances, given that the surname Sayyid is often more common amongst the persecuted Shia community in Uttar Pradesh, including those who belong to the Julaha or weaver caste. Thus, caste becomes an even more perplexing phenomenon and analytic when understood in non-Hindu contexts, given the histories and genealogical production of caste and caste erasures, particularly amongst Muslims in urban cities of Uttar Pradesh. This has led to a particular kind of subaltern identity where the state is actually central to obliterating caste amongst Muslims, and genealogical constructions of caste or caste-like status amongst Muslims were and are heavily contingent on social and political expediency at varying historical junctures. This is a timely topic in some senses, given the recent round of reflections on creating a caste census in India, which should include Muslims. Often grounded in Islamic conceptions of privilege and nepotism in ruling dynasties, and of course heavily influenced by Hinduism, Hindu stratifications of caste and caste divisions can obviously not be simplistically implanted as unmutated or unmodified onto Islamic Indic identities. Nor can we center, as I argue, caste without it being in conversation with how religious minoritization of Muslims has served as a homogenizing parameter in constructing the figure of the Muslim in India. Therefore, in this talk, I will note the following overlapping sites of Muslim racialization in India: the construction of caste in post-colonial governmentality, its links to socio-economic status of Muslims, India's casteist Islamophobia or caste-informed anti-Muslim communalism, and lastly, the unique challenges of conversion and recognition in Pasmanda Muslim politics. Instead of merely borrowing and applying global north theories of racialization in India, I conceptualize Muslim racialization in India along the tropes of what I understand to be both casteist Islamophobia and caste-like practices within the Muslim community. Furthermore, borrowing from, but also building upon the brilliant works of several critical race studies scholars, I also highlight in my book manuscript that beyond the politics of visibility and counting, projects that seek to invisibilize the complex realities of disempowered groups is also the breadth force of racialization. By some estimates, between 75 to 85% of Muslims are from convert, lower caste, and Dalit backgrounds. Most of these conversions took place in medieval to mid-20th century India, and even under colonialism, scholars like Galanter had written about depressed class Muslims or Dalit Muslims who were recognized by the British Raj as particularly vulnerable groups that faced extreme poverty and social stigma as well. However, the politics of colonial census collection of caste was not free from its constraints, as observed by religion studies scholar Remy Delage on the problems of governmentality. Quote, since many Hindus who converted to Islam took on the name Sheikh when they were required to register with colonial census officials, the entire community was further dragged down the social ladder, which shows the disjunction that may sometimes exist between a group's theoretical level in the caste hierarchy and an individual's actual social status. End quotes. This is vital to keep in mind in the politics of census administration. The disjuncture between social actuality and genealogical productions especially when avenues of upliftment for socio-economic backwardness is not offered to marginalized communities. As Tanveer Fazal has shown in his brilliant work, the condition for some of the most oppressed caste Muslims changed drastically for the worse under post-colonial governmentality. Under the Presidential Order of 1950, Article 341, Clause 3, India refused to recognize Dalit and lower caste Muslims and Christians as a separate entity, and therefore as those who could avail benefits associated with Dalit and lower caste emancipation, such as reservations or affirmative action policies in education and government employment. Subsequently, this order was amended in 1956 to include Sikhs, and once again in 1990 to bring Buddhism under the ambit of Hindu personal law. And therefore, Sikhs and Buddhists can now avail affirmative action policies. Unlike contentions that claim that Ashraf or upper caste Muslim political figures did not advocate for lower caste Muslims, my archival research of the Constituent Assembly debates in India produced a more complicated picture. Some Ashraf or elite Muslim leaders, such as Muhammad Ismail, actually made passionate appeals for affirmative action policies to be extended to what he termed as, quote, backward Muslimans. Others, like scheduled caste Dalit leaders, such as MC Raja, also noted the blatant hypocrisy against Muslims in the Presidential Order of 1950 and reiterated his views in 1956 when the Presidential Order was expanded in 1956 to include Sikhs. However, victory was eventually attained by the majority of upper caste Congress leaders and their Hinduized Dalit allies who wanted to restrict the affiliation of Dalits to Hindu society exclusively. It is also worth noting here that mass conversion specifically to Buddhism and Sikhism was actually not opposed by Hindu Mahasabha leaders such as Gowalkar, who viewed these faiths as akin to Hindu culture or indigenous to Indian soil, unlike Islam and Christianity. The attempts to deny caste amongst non-Hindus persisted in the Constituent Assembly throughout the democratic setup years of the 1950s, even when there was evidence to the contrary. In 1955, the first Backward Classes Commission, led by Chair Kaka Kalekar, submitted its report to the Constituent Assembly, officially recognizing the presence of, quote, backward communities amongst Muslims. Despite Kalekar's observation that lower caste and Dalit Muslims were, quote, twice discriminated by society and state, the commission upheld that the absence of caste as a religious category in Islam meant that Muslims were not in need of reservations. These developments are also telling of how India's post-colonial governmentality was premised on a Hindu public sphere with a nod of emancipation for discriminated Hindus and Hinduized Dalit groups. It was not just the Constituent Assembly that repeatedly refused to recognize the legacy and impact of being from marginalized caste backgrounds for Muslims, but other apparatuses of the liberal democratic Indian state too, including the Supreme Court of India. In two landmark cases, each filed by lower caste and Dalit Muslims, one in 1969 and another as recently as 2015, the Supreme Court of India refused to give Dalit Muslims and lower caste Muslims the right to affirmative action unless they reverted to Hinduism. In short, consistent efforts were made to ensure that caste-based affirmative action was made tenable only for Hindus or those who fell under the ambit of Hindu law, to the exclusion of Christians and Muslims unless they reverted to Hinduism to avail those benefits. I refer to this process of removing caste-based affirmative action for other backward caste, Adivasi, and Dalit Muslims as an institutional endeavor to decastify Muslims. Furthermore, as I illustrate in my book manuscript that I'm currently revising, the secular government of India deployed various sites to signal Muslims as a homogenous community. Despite significant institutional barriers, oppressed caste Muslim organizations, terming themselves as Pasmanda Muslim organizations, have come to the fore since the 1990s and early 2000s to state their social and political claims as caste conscience building actors in the community. For an excellent analysis on working class Muslim theologies and social formations in Uttar Pradesh and South Asia, I would direct people to read the sensitive works of Joel Lee and Sohaib Niazi on the subject. I reckon that the study of institutional decastification of Muslims, along with Pasmanda Muslim politics, underscores complex and even contested conceptions of caste justice in the diverse Pasmanda community. Furthermore, unlike certain claims that conversion didn't change anything for Pasmanda Muslims, my research exploring both vernacular Urdu and Hindi literatures, as well as ethnographic interviews with Pasmanda Muslims from different walks of life, revealed a more complicated understanding of their place in religion, history, and indeed their relationship with the Indian state. Amid the roaring election victory of the BJP in 2017, I met up with some key socio-political actors in the Pasmanda Conscience Building Project. Located in the overcrowded road of Janpat in central Lucknow, the two-room office of Pasmanda Muslim Samaj, with its red sign inscribed in Hindi, Urdu, and English, stood out. For those who are unaware, it has become increasingly uncommon to find Urdu signs in central Lucknow, despite the romantic portrayal of the city as a once Islamicate and cosmopolitan place. The Pasmanda Muslim Samaj is relatively newer compared to some of the other organizations, such as the Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz that was founded in 94. The Pasmanda Muslim Samaj was founded in 2002, and I was kind of caught off guard when I asked one of the founding members what led to the formation of their organization. One of the main founders of the Samaj answered that it was his lived experiences of residing with Dalits who aligned themselves as Hindu and facing hostility from them that led him to initiate conversations on what he termed as shared grounds. Another founder corroborated having faced similar experiences and further lamented, quote, when Mayawati, UP's first Dalit woman chief minister, hugged Narendra Modi in the elections that took place in the aftermath of the 2002 Gujarat pogrom, hamara dil toot gaya, my heart broke, end quotes. We know that often Hindu nationalists have sought to enfold Dalits strategically in electoral politics, or what Christopher Japfrelot aptly terms as syncretic Hindutva, often facilitating violence between these two minority communities in a system that ultimately privileges Savarnas. In such a system, I feel it would be terribly unfair to only center caste and Pasmanda Muslim politics and not their religious racialization. As noted, broadly speaking, the logic of caste, which is divisions and hierarchization, is located not just among Hindus, but also Muslims. Many Dalit and lower caste Muslims across various mahallas of Lucknow told me of instances of meat being thrown at them from a distance during Eid, a festival supposedly meant to mark solidarity among rich and poor Muslims feasting together, or not being allowed to touch the hands of Ashraf Muslims, particularly those who claim to profess either a noble Indian heritage or direct linkages to the Prophet's family. Dalit Muslims were not allowed to touch Ashraf hands because these Dalits were conceived to be arjal or despicable in their very soul. Local activist literatures in Urdu also reveal, such as works by Muhammad Umar in the 1970s and the more popular and recent works of Masood Alam Falahi and Ali Anwar, that condescension towards Pasmanda Muslims is often masqueraded under ideas of class and khandani or family line values amongst Muslims in Uttar Pradesh. One Pasmanda Muslim even maintained that the clergy has actively benefited from not educating Muslims about, quote, true Islam, one where we are all equal and don't need them in the first place to play as mediators between us and God, end quotes. More importantly, he noted that the project of obliterating caste amongst Muslims was heavily contingent on, quote, making Muslims unaware of their histories of oppression so that they won't read religion from a perspective of liberation, but one of following the orders of upper caste clergymen, end quotes. It is worth noting here that religious issues amongst Muslims have been politically represented by NGOs such as All India Personal Law Board. This NGO is overwhelmingly dominated by a body of nepotistic and elite ulema, many of whom are not even elected to the organization. Why then did the Indian state choose to engage with these actors and strengthen their bid especially during the notorious Shah Bano divorce case in the late 1980s versus other progressive and Islamic feminist actors at the time. It is also crucial to keep in mind how these controversial politics of representation and recognition went on to shape how Islam and Muslim backwardness came to be framed in post-colonial India. Simultaneously, like any movement with its pitfalls, it is also imperative to note here that the wider Pasmanda Muslim movement is still male-dominated, and there is a notable absence of women in their leadership ranks. The 1980s was a critical era when the Hinduization of Dalits in UP under the aegis of Jan Sangh also coincided with what can be understood as the Islamization of Dalit and lower caste Muslims. By some estimates, migration for manual laborer jobs in the Gulf increased by nearly a tenfold in UP during this period. And for Pasmanda Muslims, mostly from Sunni sectarian backgrounds, centering the sectarian identity in genealogical construction served as a more useful link than their caste identity per se in these countries. Although, of course, we know that Gulf Arab racism against new convert working class South Asian Muslims runs deep. Nonetheless, Pasmanda Muslim Samaj organizers maintain that these developments also had an impact on Pasmanda memory politics, along with the rise of upper caste-led initiatives of Hindutva in UP, to the point that they claim that many lower caste Muslims do not even remember the exact caste, and the word Pasmanda aims to capture the ambiguity of what lower caste or casteless positionalities have come to denote for historically disadvantaged Muslims. Pasmanda Muslim Samaj organizers also noted that lack of advocacy and programs that particularly uplifted historically disadvantaged and socioeconomically precarious Muslim communities. They claimed and accused that elite Ashraf Muslims were either too invested in posing as liberal, secular, and cosmopolitan citizens before their elite and middle class Hindu friends, or corrupt and elite ulama forces in UP were cashing in on their expertise as self-proclaimed religious authorities because of their educational affiliation in some institution in the Middle East, rather than tangibly aiding the socio-economic backwardness of their brethren. Spurned by the state and with nobody willing to acknowledge their continuing histories of oppression and extreme poverty, the weavers and artisanals eventually began to identify themselves with Arabic surnames such as Ansaris, the butchers as Qurayshis, and sanitation and Bhishti caste Muslims as Sheikhs, with surnames such as Siddiqis, Osmanis, and Omars very common amongst them, as noted by Richard Cox. All of these were efforts made within the community to claim a genealogy that was always in an Islamic time-space continuum, or one that was Arab or Central Asian in its descent, to downplay, if not deny, their conversion backgrounds that had only brought them social stigma from all. I think it is also worth mentioning here how David Lelyvan, in his excellent work, has explored murky genealogies of prominent figures under British colonialism, such as Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who most likely constructed his own genealogy in a bid to render himself as a legible and respective authoritative figure in elite colonial structures of representation. Furthermore, many Pasmanda Muslims themselves observed that conversion in and of itself was an important act of resistance, both against the prescriptions of being outed for their caste via their names or facing indignity for their occupations, as well as today challenging Ashraf narratives of Islam and claims to the privilege of representing the community. Given this, it is alarming to come across scholarships that seem to imply that conversion didn't change anything for those who left the Hindu fold. Surely, even B.R. Ambedkar, who famously organized mass conversion campaigns in the 1930s, would disagree with such a perspective. Significantly, this project of distancing themselves from the stigma of castelessness or lower caste status is also not unique to Pasmanda Muslims in India. Several Dalit and lower caste groups, especially via migration to parts of India far away from their original locale, engaged in similar practices or what Ramchandra Rawat labels as symbolic advancement in new societies. Unfortunately, such genealogical constructions by some Pasmanda Muslims have played into otherizing narratives of the Hindu right, who since colonial times have propagated and perpetuated the idea that all Muslims in India are foreign medieval invaders. However, it is imperative to note here that Hindu nationalist leaders such as Savarkar also famously contended that anyone born on Indian soil was a Hindu who could revert to the religion, seeing as he did to frame Hinduism as akin to territorial belonging. Over time, many lower caste and Dalit Muslims in my study claim that casteist attitudes towards them have changed, at least overtly. This is because as Hindu nationalism became a greater threat for Muslims, even Ashraf Muslims began to face subordination and loss of their culture and language, facing issues such as housing segregation in newer parts of the city and discrimination in the job market. Notably, during the infamous Moradabad massacre in 1989, for which there is ample of evidence of police brutality against Muslims, it was Ashraf elites who were specifically targeted, such as the famous brass industrialists of Moradabad. They faced intense persecution, sexual violence, and poverty overnight, crystallizing into an affirmation of an Indian Muslim collective identity based on shared concerns over violence, subordination, and stigmatization of the community. Therefore, Ashraf Muslims needed Pasmanda Muslims too, in order to be recognized for the marginalization they faced collectively as Muslims in Uttar Pradesh, and Pasmanda Muslim joined alliances with those who had at least some social capital relative to them. This is not at all to suggest that casteism doesn't persist in the Muslim community or is on the decline. But clearly, caste conceptions and practices in Muslim societies of India should not be viewed as sealed categories or absolutists in their values of propriety, but also contingent and contextual. Different Muslim societies across different parts of South Asia seem to have their own understandings of desirability and caste-like conceptions, and they further intersect in ideas of piety and religious identity formation in significant ways. Very importantly, these processes and contestations over caste and religion were further compounded by deep institutional discrepancies and dilemma. Until 1993, no OBC or Dalit Muslim was given reservation in jobs and education. When a small number of disadvantaged Muslims were finally given recognition by the implementation of the BP Mandal Commission, they had to compete with Hindu OBCs and Dalits in an already anti-Muslim atmosphere. Many Dalit Muslims complained that they were often lumped with OBC Muslim groups, despite the fact that they had different needs. Others noted that several OBC Muslim groups were missing from the Mandal Commission list with no explanation. In addition, there were often discrepancies between the central government's shorter list of recognized OBC Muslims compared to the provincial government's longer list of OBC Muslims. These debates within the Muslim and Pasmanda Muslim community are extremely important to illustrate and highlight, especially at a time when the Sachar Committee report of 2005 observed that while there are backward Muslim castes in the diverse body of Muslims in India, Muslims, irrespective of their caste status, lag behind Hindu OBCs and Dalits in government jobs and access to higher education. Again, this is not to underestimate the persistence of casteism and caste-like practices, but it is also interesting to note how the declining socio-economic status and religious homogenization of Muslims have allowed for a kind of complicated political ethos to emerge, which cannot be accorded similarly to Hindus. This is in no small part due to both Hinduism and Islam in India getting increasingly politicized, but in unequal power dynamics. During my ethnographic fieldwork, I witnessed a phenomena which can perhaps be best encapsulated as casteist Islamophobia. Pasmanda Muslims noted that whereas once Ashraf Muslims called them arjal or despicable, today Hinduized Dalits call them betrayers and hyper-nationalist narratives of local belonging for converting to an alien faith. Ashraf Muslims meanwhile claim that the discourses of being deemed as dirty, unhygienic, and being referred to as smells or smelly because they eat meat, descriptors that were formerly attributed only to Dalits, as well as growing hate inciting atmosphere of sexually charged and derogatory terms such as katwa, ascribed to Muslim men who are circumcised, have become a shared frame of reference, which has led them to align with Pasmanda Muslims from a place of declining privilege and growing stigmatization of the community as a whole. Thus, Religion too, across caste divides, has been a shared ground for many Pasmanda Muslims with Ashraf Muslims. Just like their activist aims of establishing solidarity with Dalits and OBCs, Pasmanda Muslims also overwhelmingly shared tales with me about how much the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992 mattered to them. And unlike certain scholarships, insisted that it should not be viewed as an exclusively Ashraf concern when they commemorate the event. In fact, it was a Mansouri/OBC Muslim gentleman, Mr. Hashim Ansari, who lodged the first FIR in 1949 against the placement of a Ram idol on the grounds where the Babri Masjid previously stood. And this happened when the secular government of the Congress was in power. It is perhaps worth noting here that the term secular itself was added to the Indian Constitution in 1975 amid Sanjay Gandhi's sterilization efforts that particularly targeted Muslims in North India. Reflecting on Islamophobia in contemporary India, a Qureshi Muslim pointed out to me, and I think this is a really great quote over here. Quote, when upper caste Hindus call butchers unhygienic, when they call us janwar se bhi battar, worse than animals, they are historicizing us based on Brahmin notions of vegetarianism and social hygiene without outright calling us Dalits. But the language has strong undertones of caste, end quotes. Therefore, it is perhaps not an exaggeration to note that the unique trajectory of India's Islamophobia is itself coded in North Indian Brahmanical norms and values, and as such, India's anti-Muslim politics and discursive frameworks are deeply embedded in casteist conceptions and discourses. Often there's a tendency to imagine Islamophobia in India as grounded only in religious differences between Hindus and Muslims. But along with global discourses that have reinforced violence and discrimination of Muslims in the post 9/11 world, how India's unique trajectory of Islamophobia is embedded in Hindu casteist politics of framing and conceptualizing the Muslim other, aka casteist Islamophobia, is vital in our analysis. Tellingly, while most scholars seem to have established a consensus that identity formations are dynamic and they get redefined in political projects and they evolve over time in varying contexts, it is somewhat confounding to note how sometimes in the literature or how we talk about caste-like practices in different Muslim societies of India, there's a notable absence of structural constraints placed on Pasmanda Muslim politics. Not just by Ashrafs, not just by Hinduized Dalit and Bahujan groups, but also the normalizing of casteist Islamophobia and the historical complicity of the liberal democratic apparatus of the Indian state that privileges Brahmin and other upper caste Savarna Hindus. Furthermore, institutional and political endeavors to produce and reproduce caste and religion by the Indian state underscores the necessity to unpack how sociological categories emerge, the processes under which they are delineated, and the context in which they are mobilized or thickened or omitted altogether. Although the 2009 Ranganathan Mishra Committee report suggested that caste should be religion neutral, like scheduled tribe status, the present regime is in no mood to entertain such suggestions. Certainly, the production of caste and the production of religion are still being defined by Indian state authorities. And for scholars who now use caste as a stick to beat Muslims with, keep in mind that currently Indian Muslim representation in the parliament is at its lowest in the past 7 years. Pasmanda Muslims, meanwhile, find themselves at the crossroads of casteism, Islamophobia, and even dangerously simplistic assumptions with no political representation whatsoever. With this, I come back to the question of Pasmanda Muslim organizing in seemingly impossible times. The various sides of Pasmanda Muslim politics of recognition are fraught and with multiple implications. Firstly, conversion was and has been an important act of agency and resistance. Agency for many Pasmanda Muslim activists and residents is not one that is located in the material world only. In the words of Anis Mansouri, quote, "We have an Islam of our own, an Islam of resistance. We don't need the state or the Ashraf to tell us who we are. We have always been here," end quotes. In some ways, the struggle for Pasmanda Muslim politics supersedes the politics of recognition to a politics of Pasmanda Islam that centers the unique experiences of casteism and anti-Muslim racialization without losing its nuance and getting over-determined in a Hindu-Brahmanical system. Secondly, the politics of census making is the politics of fixing identities and generating universal assumptions or making facts. Facts that cannot be determined without accounting for their conceptual, methodological, implementational, and even utilitarian purposes. This is particularly fraught when certain narratives represent indigenous history or indigenizing efforts as equivalent to Hinduism or Hinduizing. While caste marginalized Muslims must be empowered and their lived realities brought to the fore, it is also simultaneously worth contemplating that with the passage of the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act that will leave millions of Muslims stateless, how do we cautiously attend to projects that seek to distinguish between poor, illiterate, and often undocumented Muslims on the basis of their heritage or lineage? Increasingly, the figure of the Muslim has become a pathologized figure, a figure of righting perceived and real medieval wrongs, of assuaging majoritarian sensibilities for post-colonial revenge. Relatedly, while in principle a census that documents the presence of marginalized castes can indeed be used towards equity and justice, it is equally imperative to keep in mind that the politics of enumeration and defining caste in Muslim setups is more fraught for the schematic state beyond questions of redistributive justice. In fact, elite upper caste Hindu state administrators, and as I've sought to highlight today, legislative and juridical pronouncements continue to define the parameters of these categories with very real material implications for the groups inscribed as such, and not necessarily for the best interests of the marginalized. This also compels us to examine the base upon which the supposedly secular foundation of Indian liberal democracy was built, and how the language of liberalism and difference was central towards how Muslims, including their caste histories, was invisibilized. And today, we are asking them to out their caste, often in troubling ways. Lastly, this caution also holds true for academic enterprises that can be complicit in dehumanizing India's Muslims. This also includes academic platforms that invite far-right ministers and movie directors who seek validation from prestigious American universities over hallowed grounds of academic freedom and freedom of expression. Furthermore, the lens of the study and dubious proclamations that only secularism or overarching frameworks of caste can reveal the true depths of Indian politics can also serve as sites of negating and even simplifying the complex realities of Muslim marginalization today. This is happening in a time when Pasmanda Muslims just last week in the Porbandar district of Gujarat have appealed to the Supreme Court of India to mass euthanize their community of 600 members because they can no longer deal with the state and everyday discrimination and violence they face from state authorities. This news is frankly beyond depressing when poor and marginalized Muslims have very legitimate concerns and skepticism towards the state, to the extent that today they are almost the living dead and appealing for straightforward necropolitics. In conclusion, if caste is analogous to racialization, and religion a critical site of racialized inscriptions, then Pasmanda Muslim politics of recognition needs to be situated in India's castiest forms of Islamophobia, casteism and caste-like practices amongst Muslims through the specific understandings of the societies in which they operate in, and to also exercise caution in liberal academic endeavors that mark the lower caste and lower class Muslim body as marked objects of study and knowing, and not as actors who are living, thriving, and complicated actors of their own making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sanober Umar. I would say that it's not easy, with your, it's not always the case where academic brilliance informs certain kind of a radical praxis in academia. And in your case, as an Indian woman Muslim, the precarity of your situation, informs your politics, your scholarship. And I really appreciate and really grateful for the passion with which you have presented your work and argued the case for Pasmanda Muslims. I'm really, really grateful for this fantastic talk. And I just have few comments, not really questions in that sense, because I was really struck by this emphasis on the politics of recognition and enumeration, especially as it involves, right from the founding of the republic in the first census as it was carried out in the 1950s, as to how the Indian state obliterates the notion of Muslim caste and insists on a certain kind of a homogenized identity. And I presume that in doing so, there is certain kind of a complicity of the Indian Muslim elite as well, who would like to think of Islam as an egalitarian kind of a force which does not recognize caste. And that sort of like fits into that notion about Islam in a certain kind of ways. And I also think that I was reminded of how of similar developments which were taking place in Pakistan, contrasting developments which were taking place in Pakistan around the same time. There is now very good work by Ghazal Asif and Sadia Mahmood on Sindhi Hindus. And when the first census were to be carried out in Pakistan in 1951, the state recognized that category of Dalits as one of the categories. And in fact, the Hindu members of the Constituent Assembly, they were opposed to it, and they said that this will kind of like create more divisions, more fissures, and so they were in case of Pakistan, the Hindu members of the assembly were opposed to recognizing caste as one of the categories, whereas, as you say, in case of India, it was a major sort of like a category through which some form of some idea of retributive justice could be carried out. So these are very, very important developments, as you have pointed out. With that, I think we come to the end of this fantastic event. Thank you so much, Professor Sanober Umar. Once again, I would say the kind of work that you're doing, it's not easy for so many reasons. As you pointed out, there is no stable concept of an archive for that kind of research to conduct. You have to go out in the field, conduct interviews, and look for documents which, in a way, are not really even easily accessible, even if they cover some aspect of Dalit history, Dalit Muslim history in India, and also the kind of political oppression within which scholars have to operate these days. Not scholars, but so many other communities, marginalized communities, which are at the receiving end of incredible violence under this Hindutva regime. So thank you so much for your work and for your radical politics in this very important critical period. And I would like to thank Simrit and Lalita for organizing this and for making these fantastic arrangements. And once again, thank you so much, Professor Umar, for your work.
Thank you.